The air in Tennessee, in the summer of 1853, did not simply exist. It possessed. It was a thick, wet blanket of heat that settled over the land with a suffocating weight, smelling of loam, of blooming magnolias whose sweetness had begun to curdle into something cloying, and of something else, something metallic, lingering beneath it all, like a coin held on the tongue. It was the kind of heat that made a man's linen shirt cling to his skin, a damp, unpleasant second layer. On the sprawling plantation, known as Oak Grove, this air clung especially tight to the rows of cotton dresses and linen shirts hung out to dry in the yard, the fabrics moving with a listless, ghostly sway in the still, oppressive afternoon. In the distance, the house stood as a monument to cold order amidst the sweltering chaos of nature. Its white pillars were bone-like against the deep green of the woods, its windows dark and reflective, eyes that had witnessed much and now refused to see what was unfolding within. Under its vast, shadowed roof, the routines of the day played out with a strained, fragile normalcy. There was the faint chime of a spoon against fine china as the mistress took her afternoon tea, her movements slow, deliberate. There was the world, unaware that the very shadows they cast had begun to deepen, to coalesce into forms they could not name, could not see, and from which they would find no escape. Behind the main house, in a low, long building where the air was still and thick with dust motes dancing in the slivers of light from high windows, the true heart of the household beat. Here, rows of enslaved women sat on hard wooden benches, their bodies bent in perpetual submission, their hands a ceaseless flutter of industry. The only sounds were the soft pull of thread through cloth, the snip of scissors, and the low, shared breath of labor. And among them was Louisa Dot. She was a study in stillness amidst motion. Slender, back straight, she possessed a grace that seemed out of place in the drudgery of the sewing room. Her fingers, long and deft, did not fumble or hurry. They moved with a terrifying, mechanical precision, guiding a needle through silk as if it were an extension of her own will. Her face was a placid mask, smooth and unreadable. But her eyes were not placid. Dark and deep-set, they were pools of still water that held more than mere obedience. They held the memory of 1,000 indignities. They held a sorrow so profound it had become a geological layer of her being. And they held a resolve, cold and sharp as the needle in her master. His presence a dark blot in the doorway, the brim of his hat casting his face into a slab of shadow as he surveyed his domain. They moved through Theahand. Louisa's work was an intimate treason. She hemmed the mistress's fine gowns, her fingers tracing the curves of the woman's body in the negative space of the fabric. She mended the tears in the master's waistcoats, the very cloth that hugged his torso. She embroidered delicate flowers onto the christening gowns of newborns and patched the rough and tumble jackets of the children. Every garment, from the most delicate underthing to the heaviest wool coat, passed through her hands. And with each pass of the needle, with each tiny, perfect stitch, a silent calculus was performed. A decision was made, a thread pulled a fraction too tight, a hem folded over upon itself one too many times, creating a hidden, padded layer. The family dressed in her labor each morning, embracing the garments that bore her touch, blissfully ignorant of the meticulous, patient venom being woven into the very fiber of their lives. It began not with a scream, but with a sigh. A faint pink rash bloomed on the mistress's inner wrist. She dismissed it, waving a languid hand. The heat, she murmured to the humid air, or perhaps gnats. Then the children began to complain. Little Robert, his face flushed, wind of chills that came upon him, even in the stifling heat of his nursery. His sister, Eliza, cried that her legs ached, a deep throb that rest and cool cloths could not soothe. The master's temper, always a smoldering ember, ignited into sudden, irrational flares. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, took on a dull, confused glaze, as if he were trying to remember a name that perpetually eluded him. The family physician, a Dr. Prescott, was summoned. He was a man of ledgers and lists, of measured tones and practiced concern. He examined the symptoms with a furrowed brow, the nausea, the dizziness, the angry inflammation of the skin, the faint tremor in the master's hand. He prescribed tonics of bitter herbs, recommended rest in darkened rooms, and spoke of the summer fever that was making its rounds, of the miasmic air rising from the marshes, of perhaps a tainted well. His eyes scanned the rooms, the beds, the patients, but they slid right over Louisa, who stood in the corner, her head bowed, her hands clasped. She was part of the furniture, a tool, invisible. Her lips, thin and pale, remained sealed. Around the third week, the first death arrived. It did not come with a clamor, but with a terrible final silence. The youngest daughter, Annabelle, simply did not wake. She was found pale and perfectly still in her small bed, her favorite doll tucked under her arm, her skin cool to the touch. There was no drama, no last words, only the immense, crushing quiet that follows a extinguished life. Then the matriarch, the master's mother, began to fail. Her silver hair, once meticulously coiffed, fell out in thin, brittle wisps. Her skin, papery and thin, blistered and wept a clear, oily fluid. Her breathing became a shallow, ragged sound, like dry leaves scraping against stone. Dr. Prescott's unease curdled into alarm. His tidy diagnosis of fever unraveled. His suspicions, reluctantly, turned to poison. He ordered the family's clothing confiscated, sealed in oilcloth, and brought to his study. He peered at the garments, noting strange things, faint oily residues in the armpits of shirts, subtle discolorations along the inner linings of dresses, a stiffness to certain seams that shouldn't be there. But the science of the time was a blunt instrument. His chemical tests were rudimentary, inconclusive. There were no laboratories to send samples to, only intuition pitted against the rising tide of rumor. The mistress, in her final delirium-ridden hours, whispered of terrible things, of a feeling of weightlessness, as if her bones were dissolving, of a fire that seemed to burn beneath her skin, a cold fire that no water could quench. The master's appetite vanished completely. His unsettled eyes, now sunken in their sockets, would dart around the room, scanning the faces of his servants with a new emotion, a terrifying cocktail of fear and a dawning, horrific curiosity. And through it all, Louisa continued. An observer would see nothing changed. She sat at her bench, her posture erect, her movements rhythmic and assured. But a new current of energy now snaked through the household. Whispers were exchanged in the kitchen, in the stables, in the quarters, whispers of linens that burned the flesh, of a faint, bitter almond scent that sometimes clung to a freshly mended dress. Hushed warnings were passed from one servant to another. Don't you wear that satin blouse, the one she just let out. Don't let the children put on those mended stockings. The seamstress's quarters became a place of unspoken dread. Yet she remained oddly untouched by suspicion. She existed in that liminal space reserved for the enslaved between visibility and invisibility. Her work was her voice. Her silence was her shield. And her needle, it seemed, was her weapon of choice. Once the small, quiet coffins of the children were carried out, once the widow's weeping became a permanent fixture in the hollowed-out halls, the whispers grew bolder, more specific. Did the seamstress slip something into the thread? Could a poison be hidden in the dye? Could it be pressed into the cloth, some tuberous oil crushed and worked into the very lining? No one had seen her prepare anything unusual, but every corpse had been clothed in her handiwork, her neat patches, her intricate monograms, her deceptively delicate lace. The rumors began to form a story. The seamstress, they said, had been taught by an old woman, a midwife named Bet, now long gone. They spoke of herbal lore passed down in stolen moments, names of plants that could kill a man slowly when applied to the skin, doses so subtle they could be administered over months, even years. No one in the big house would ever confirm such tales. Louisa herself never spoke of it. In the ledgers, she was listed as Louisa, seamstress, obedient, efficient, but every frayed seam she mended, every torn cuff she repaired, seemed to bind the suspicion tighter around her. The house, in its final days, was a portrait of Gothic decay. The humid air within grew heavy, layered with the smells of sick, the sweet, putrid sweat, the temps of bile, the underlying scent of fear. The few servants who remained moved like phantoms through the gloom, their footsteps hesitant on the polished floors, careful not to disturb the awful silence that had replaced the household's former rhythms. The White family had retreated into the depths of the house, prisoners in their own rooms. Behind closed doors, linen sheets were soaked through with perspiration, and strange, weeping lesions continued to appear on the skin of those who still wore the fine garments that came from Louisa's hands. But the true origin of this story did not begin with the first feverish tremor or the first death rattle. It began years earlier, in the brutal geography of Louisa's own life. She had been born into bondage on a tobacco farm in North Carolina and sold south to Tennessee at the age of 14. The bill of sale, a cold, bureaucratic document, listed the reason for her disposal merely as a disciplinary incident, a vague term that hid a universe of pain. There were rumors, never spoken above a whisper, about a white overseer's son who had taken a violent liking to her, and how that boy had later been found convulsing in the barley field, dead before he could even cry out. When Louisa arrived at Oak Grove, she was preternaturally quiet, her composure unnerving. She possessed an innate, stunning skill with a needle, a talent that marked her as valuable and thus spared her from the backbreaking labor of the fields. She was placed in the seamstress's quarters, under the direct and often cruel supervision of the house mistress. What no one knew, what no one cared to know, was that Louisa carried with her far more than just a needle and thread. In her first years on the plantation, she had formed a quiet, profound bond with an older woman named Bet. Bet was slow, her eyes clouded with cataracts, but her mind was a vast library of forgotten knowledge. She remembered the old ways, the names of plants that could heal a fever or stop a bleeding wound, when applied differently, make a man bleed from the inside out. Bet had seen her own children sold off one by one. The weight of that loss had settled in the tremor of her hands. She passed these dangerous teachings on to Louisa, not out of malice, but as a last, desperate act of preservation, a weaponization of memory itself. Under the innocent guise of gathering herbs for dyes or for washing the fine linens, Louisa learned to identify the sources of subtle poisons. The White family never questioned her comings and goings. Why would they? She was fetching things to better serve them. She collected the tiny, deadly seeds of the gypsyweed, dried the deceptively beautiful berries of belladonna, scraped the toxic resin from the bark of wild hemlock. Each plant had its own language, its own rhythm of harm. Alone, they were dangerous, combined in exact, meticulous quantities and infused into the hidden layers of fabric, the inner linings of vests, the seams of petticoats, the padded hems of coats. They could whisper death directly into the pores of the skin. No one suspected the seamstress. Her role was too mundane, too domestic, too feminine to inspire such a dark fear. She stitched, she obeyed. She was a ghost in the background, but with each garment that passed through her hands, a silent verdict was delivered. A thread was chosen not for its strength, but for its ability to hold a poisonous resin. A hidden fold was created, a small pocket stitched shut, its contents known only to her. She worked with a patience that was itself a kind of terror. Time was her ally. Death did not need to be swift. In fact, its slowness was the point. By the peak of that hellish summer, a terrifying pattern had begun to emerge, even among the enslaved. Those who handled the family's laundry too frequently began to sicken. A young maid, gifted a handmade down shawl, collapsed in the kitchen with violent convulsions. A stable boy tasked with carrying an armload of freshly laundered coats to the main house developed weeping ulcers on his hands and arms that refused to heal. The plantation doctor, his mind reeling, began to suspect a pervasive environmental toxin, perhaps a mold in the old grain storage, or a stagnation in the well water. But nothing fit. The symptoms were erratic, uniquely brutal. The white family, clinging to their fraying dignity, dismissed his concerns as Negro superstition. Within the quarters, the whispers traveled on a different frequency. They began to speak of Louisa's hands as being either blessed or cursed. Some gave her a wide berth, their eyes wide with fear. Others left small, quiet offerings at the threshold of her sleeping area, a spool of black thread, a few beads, a rare root. They were not gifts, they were acknowledgments. A silent understanding passed between them. They knew, or they guessed, but the code of survival forbade them from ever speaking it aloud. The family's physical decline was now matched by their mental unraveling. Their youngest son, a once robust boy, became a gaunt skeleton, his skin stretched tight over his bones. The master of the house began to hallucinate, screaming at shadows in the corner of his study, accusing his own surviving children of conspiring against him. The mistress rarely left her bed, her eyes glazed and unseeing, her breath a ragged, wet sound that echoed down the hallway. Rumors of witchcraft began to slip beyond the plantation's boundaries. A traveling fire and brimstone preacher was summoned. He walked through the house, Bible clutched in his hand, and declared it filled with a profound sorrow and a spiritual rot. But he found no devil, no clear sign of Satan's work. And through it all, Louisa remained preternaturally calm, her fingers forever moving, the whisper of her needle through cloth a constant counterpoint to the death rattles in the rooms above. One night, the house cook, a woman named Martha, claimed she saw Louisa standing at the edge of the woods, speaking softly to someone or something that was not there. A shadow, she said, that moved like an old woman, perhaps the ghost of Bet. But when questioned, Louisa merely lowered her eyes, a gesture of submission they all knew so well, and resumed her sewing. Her silence was a wall. The plantation, once a symbol of proud, unassailable power, now bore the unmistakable scent of decay. And at the heart of the rot, Louisa stitched on each pull of the thread a quiet, devastating act of defiance. Each hemline a veil drawn between vengeance and the blessed anonymity of the unseen. By late August, the grand piano in the parlor of Oak Grove had fallen silent for good. A fine layer of dust settled on its dark wood, and the air in the room no longer carried the faint echo of Chopin or polite conversation. What remained was the sound of the house itself, dying, the slow, labored breath of its inhabitants, the creak of a floorboard under the weight of a shuffling step, the occasional hack and cough that seemed to tear itself from a ruined chest. The family's decline was no longer a mystery. It was a grim, accepted fact. One by one, they were being erased by a malady that defied medicine, prayer, and reason. The master, a man who had once commanded rooms with his mere presence, was now a shambling ghost in his own home. His skin had taken on a sickly yellow hue, his eyes sunken into bruised sockets. He muttered to himself, reciting names, some of living relatives, some of men, long dead, and would often flinch violently at the touch of his own clothing. His shirts, freshly laundered and starched, seemed to ignite a terrible itching across his flesh. During a strained dinner with two business associates from Alabama, he had ripped his collar open with a strangled cry, buttons scattering across the floor. Before collapsing into a fit of tremors that left the guests pale and speechless, they did not stay the night. His wife had retreated so far into her illness that she no longer recognized her own reflection. Her skin was a landscape of small suppurating eruptions that wept a thin, bloody fluid whenever she shifted in her bed. The new physician, a Dr. Walsh summoned from Memphis, suggested arsenic poisoning, though he admitted the dermal symptoms were baffling. He ordered all fabrics removed from the sick rooms and initiated a fumigation of the house with burning sulfur and herbs. The acrid smoke filled the halls, stinging the eyes, but it did nothing to cleanse the invisible miasma that clung to the place. Nothing changed. The children, those who still lived, were hollowed-out versions of their former selves. Their joints ached so terribly they could scarcely walk. Their gums bled onto their pillows at night. The family's eldest son and heir, a young man once known for his arrogance and vigor, refused to leave his bed altogether. On the rare occasions he emerged, he was incoherent, babbling about insects crawling beneath his skin and a terrible fire burning behind his eyes. He would claw at his own neck and arms until they were raw and bleeding. A nursemaid who tried to restrain him was struck with a burst of preternatural strength and fled the plantation that very night, never to return. The staff now moved through their duties with a new, pervasive dread. Their eyes no longer met those of the family. Communication was reduced to furtive glances and gestures. Among themselves, a grim certainty had taken root. They knew this was more than fever. Some began to outright refuse to handle the laundry. The laundry room, once a hub of constant activity, fell into a deserted silence. Those workers who were punished and forced to continue soon fell ill themselves, their hands and arms breaking out in the same strange, ulcerated lesions that refused to heal. A terrible equation was being written in flesh. To touch the clothes was to invite the sickness. Louisa, however, remained an island of untouched health. She did not cough. She did not ache. Her skin was clear and smooth. She kept to her corner in the sewing room, her movements as measured and precise as ever. She responded to orders with a silent nod, delivered finished garments with the same unnerving calm. But her silence had begun to take on a new quality. It was no longer just the silence of submission. It had become a presence, a heavy, watching thing. One of the housemaids, a young woman named Sarah, confided to another that months earlier, Louisa had asked her to fetch a specific root from the woods, something that wasn't used in any of the dyes or washes Sarah knew of. It had a bitter, unpleasant smell. At the time, she'd thought nothing of it. Now, her voice trembling, she wondered aloud, had it been a part of this? Was that root, whatever it was, being used for something unnatural? The suspicion crystallized into terror late one evening when the overseer's own daughter, a girl of 16, was found collapsed on the parlor floor. Her skin was fever-hot and mottled, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. She had been wearing a shawl, a beautiful, lace-trimmed thing that Louisa had spent the entire previous day repairing. The overseer, a man named Riggs, whose cruelty was legendary among the enslaved, exploded into a fury. He stormed through the house, his boots echoing like gunshots, and tore apart Louisa's small sleeping quarters in the back building. But he found nothing. Only spools of thread, needles, bundles of fabric, and the quiet, neat order of her existence. There were no strange roots, no bottles of liquid, no evidence of any kind. Louisa stood by silently during the search, her arms at her sides, her face a mask of passive observation. The following morning, Riggs demanded she be placed in chains, confined to the smokehouse until she talked. But the master, roused from his stupor, murmured a weak refusal. "She's done nothing." Nothing, he slurred, his eyes glassy and distant. The house was unraveling at its seams, and its master was too far gone to save it. That night, as if to punctuate the chaos, a fire broke out in a far storage shed. It was quickly extinguished, but the message was sent. Fear had now fully curdled into panic. Some believed the land itself was cursed. Others whispered of dark spirits, of voodoo rites conducted in the deep woods, of a rebellion being waged, not with torches and guns, but with the most domestic of instruments. And Louisa simply stitched on, her hands steady, her eyes dark and impenetrable. No one dared to stop her. The power had subtly, irrevocably, shifted. The plantation had become a museum of absences. Grand windows that had once been flung open to catch the breeze now remained shuttered, sealing the sickness and fear inside. The wide, polished halls of the manor, designed for grandeur and gossip, now echoed only with the shameful sounds of decay, the hesitant shuffle of slippers, the groan of a floorboard under a wasted frame, the wet, persistent cough that spoke of a body turning against itself. That was the arrival of Dr. Albert Greaves from Charleston that introduced a new, clinical kind of dread into the household. He was a man of modern science and rigid logic, with a reputation for diagnosing ailments that confounded rural physicians. Yet, as he moved through the opulent, death-haunted rooms of Oak Grove, even he felt a primal unease he could not quantify. His examination was thorough and methodical. He studied the afflicted, took samples of blood and vitreous fluid, documented the progression of symptoms in a precise, neat hand. But it was the clothing that held his attention. Every garment he inspected, from the master's waistcoat to the mistress's nightdress, showed the same subtle anomalies. Discolorations along the inner seams, a peculiar stiffness to certain stitches, as if the thread had been treated with something waxy or oily. A faint, bitter odor, reminiscent of almonds, clung to the fabric, cutting through the cloying sense of illness and perfume. Greaves acted decisively. He ordered that no member of the household was to wear any garment that had been prepared or mended by the seamstress. "Louisa," he spoke first to the overseer, Riggs, his tone leaving no room for argument, and then to the house staff individually. His questions about the woman in the sewing room were quiet, direct. How long had she been here? Had anyone ever seen her mixing unguents or powders? Did she gather her own plants? The answers he received were not lies, but they were not truths, either. They were evasions, silences, eyes that dropped to the floor. The silence itself was the most damning testimony. The pressure within the house reached its breaking point. Whispers in the kitchen became open accusations in the yard. The overseer, his face still flushed with the memory of his daughter's collapse, demanded Louisa be brought to the main parlor for questioning. They stood her in the center of the room, beneath the flickering light of an oil lamp. She was surrounded by the sickened, the terrified, the vengeful. They fired questions at her, their voices trembling with a fear that made them cruel. Did you handle poisonous substances? Did you put something in the cloth? Who taught you to do this? Was it the old woman? Bet. Louisa's answers were the same. A soft, toneless no, sir, or, I don't know, ma'am. Her gaze seemed to look through them, past their fear, past their accusations, to some fixed point on the far horizon. The master, too weak to leave his bed, sent down a feeble order that no action be taken without concrete proof. But proof was a luxury that fear could not afford. Greaves took samples of the fabric and performed crude chemical tests with nitric acid and other reagents. The results were suggestive of a possible metallic or plant-based toxin, but inconclusive. Science was too slow, too uncertain for the mood of the house. The staff demanded retribution. Some called for a whipping. Others, their voices low and grim, whispered of darker things: a rope, a quicklime grave, salt poured over the earth to sterilize it. The plantation was no longer operating under the rule of law, but under the raw, primal rule of dread. They called what followed a trial, but it was a mockery of one. There was no judge, no jury, only the overseer, the perplexed physician, and a gathering of frightened, angry people whose world was disintegrating around them. Louisa was dragged to a small, dank storage room beneath the house, a space used for storing bolts of cloth and old furniture, where the air was cold and thick with the smell of mildew, and the skittering of rats could be heard in the walls. She did not struggle. She did not plead. She offered no defense. She simply went, her silence more unnerving than any outburst. When the cook, a woman named Martha, who had always been kind to her, slipped a plate of food through the door crack, she later reported that Louisa was not praying. She was whispering names. Names no one in the main house recognized. Or perhaps they did, and the recognition was itself a terror. Then, a turn of events that seemed ripped from a Gothic novel. A violent storm swept through the region, a howling tempest of wind and lightning that seemed to scream its fury at the earth. A great oak tree, struck by a searing bolt of lightning, split in two with a sound like cannon fire. In the chaos and darkness that followed, as servants rushed to secure windows and doors, the lock on the storage room was found not broken, but simply open. Louisa was gone. There was no trail to follow in the rain-lashed mud, no footprints leading away from the house. The search dogs, brought in at first light, circled aimlessly before losing the scent entirely at the edge of the creek. It was as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. The overseer launched a frantic manhunt. Local marshals were contacted, but she had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a few scraps of fabric and a single, unfinished garment lying beside the door vest belonging to the master, its hem half-stitched, the needle still embedded in the cloth like a final, silent punctuation mark. The family continued to fail. One by one, they succumbed to the silence. Those who did not die never fully recovered their health. Oak Grove, once a jewel of Tennessee agriculture, fell into disrepair. Within a year, it was abandoned, its fields gone to weed, its grand house left to the mercy of the elements. And Louisa, some said she had drowned herself in the creek, weighted down by her guilt. Others insisted she had followed the North Star to freedom, aided by a network of those who knew her story and approved of her justice. But among the enslaved who remained in the surrounding counties, a different story was told for generations. It was a story of a woman who had sown death not out of mere hatred, but out of memory. A woman who did not disappear into the woods, but into legend. More than a century later, the Oak Grove plantation exists only as a skeleton. The grand White House is a ruin, half swallowed by a voracious green ivy that seems to be slowly pulling it back into the earth. Its roof has long since collapsed inward, and its walls are streaked with black water stains and the slow decay of time. Tourists rarely venture down the overgrown, rutted road that leads to it. Those who do often report a feeling of profound unease, a sense that the trees themselves are watching, their branches twisted into agonized poses. But every few years, someone is drawn to the site. Amateur historians clutching old maps, ghost hunters with their crackling EMF meters, or simply lost travelers who feel an inexplicable pull to the crumbling remains. They come for the story of the seamstress, though most only know her by that title, the seamstress, the silent one, the ghost of Oak Grove. Some versions of the tale paint her as a witch, a practitioner of dark arts, who cursed the family with otherworldly rituals. Others see her as a tragic avenger, a martyr who turned the very tools of her oppression into instruments of liberation. The objective truth, if it ever was truly known, has been lost to the relentless erosion of time. Yet, unsettling fragments of evidence persist, refusing to let the story die. In 1962, a timber magnate named Calvin Murdoch purchased the land for its valuable hardwood. While his crew was clearing debris from the main house's foundation, a worker's axe struck something hollow beneath the floorboards of what had once been the sewing room. It was a small, rusted metal trunk. Inside, carefully folded, were scraps of fabric linen, silk, woolage, one neatly labeled with a name in faded, brown ink. The names corresponded exactly with those listed in the family's burial records. Several of the fabric swatches were stained with dark, oily smudges. One of the workers, handling a piece of a child's dress, developed a severe weeping rash on his hand that persisted for weeks and defied medical treatment. Murdoch, a pragmatic man, not given to superstition, abruptly abandoned the logging operation and sold the land back for a fraction of its value. In 1985, two anthropology students from Vanderbilt University in Nashville visited the ruins for a thesis project on antebellum architecture. One of them, a young woman named Annalise Turner, wrote in her field journal that the silence at Oak Grove was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It feels like the house is holding its breath, waiting. She described finding several antique sewing needles, rusted but still sharp, driven point first into the floorboards of the sewing room, as if placed there with deliberate intent. That night, camping on the outskirts of the property, she dreamed of a woman sitting in the shadows of a ruined room, her eyes gleaming with a dark light, her hands moving endlessly over a broken sewing table. Annalise cut her research trip short and never returned. Her journal was later found among her effects. The entry on Oak Grove, the last one she ever wrote. The local historical archives hold frustratingly little about Oak Grove. Most of the plantation's records were lost during the Civil War, either burned or looted. What remains are fragments of page from a doctor's journal that ends abruptly in the summer of 1853, a death ledger that lists more names than there are graves in the small plot, and a single, heart-wrenching letter from the mistress of the house to her sister, the handwriting growing progressively more tremulous. It ends with the sentence, "She watches while we sleep." I know it now. Among the African-American communities in the surrounding towns, the oral traditions are stronger than any written record. Elder women still speak of a spirit that metes out justice, slowly and patiently. To those who deserve it, they never call her by a name, but some maintain the old custom of leaving small spools of thread on their windowsills at night, a gesture of respect, a protective charm. No one can remember who started the tradition, only that it is not wise to forget. A local preacher, a man of deep faith and skepticism, once tried to hold an exorcism on the grounds, to cleanse the land of its lingering sorrow. He lasted 3 nights before he was found, shaken and pale, packing his car in the pre-dawn light. When pressed by his congregation, he would only say, "Some wounds are too deep for prayer. Some hands never stop sewing." There are still those, historians mostly, who argue that Louisa was a fiction, a folktale born from the collective guilt and fear of a violent time, a convenient specter to blame for a tragic, unexplained illness. But they cannot explain the garments. On rare occasions, exquisitely stitched pieces of 19th century clothing, a man's cravat, a woman's bonnet, a child's finely embroidered sampler appear at estate sales or in antique shops in the region. Several collectors have reported strange occurrences upon acquiring them. One man claimed the fingertips on his right hand went numb and never regained feeling after handling a waistcoat. A woman in Knoxville fell mysteriously ill with dizziness and skin lesions days after bringing a beautifully stitched shawl into her home. No scientific explanation has ever been found, and so the legend endures, fed by these strange, unsettling echoes. The land where Oak Grove once stood remains largely untouched, not out of respect, but out of a deep, unspoken fear. The forest has reclaimed its dominion, the tree's roots buckling the last of the foundation stones. No birds sing from its crumbling chimneys, and no animals make their dens in its shadows. But if one were to brave the silence and the thorns, to push into the ruins of the sewing room, they would find scratched into the soft stone of the hearth with something sharp. A single word. 5 letters, worn by time but still legible. Louis. Was it the beginning of her name? A warning left by another? A final, fragmentary confession from a victim? No one knows. And when the wind moves through the broken skeleton of the house, sighing through the empty windows and rattling the dead vines, it doesn't sound like the wind at all. It sounds like the soft, relentless whisper of a needle pulling thread through fabric.